Chapter 3: The Port Connections. 3 days after the killing, Mateo Reyes controlled every route Victor Salazar had once managed, but the transition was far from peaceful. In the sprawling, ruthless ecosystem of Tondo, power required constant maintenance. Word of Salazar's death had created a vacuum, and some of the older, bolder street bosses thought a 19-year-old couldn't possibly hold the dead man's territory. They were wrong. When a mid-level collector named Roldan decided to withhold his weekly envelope, claiming he answered only to Salazar, Mateo didn't negotiate. He didn't send a warning. He took June and 3 of the most vicious Askel runners to the crowded cockfighting arena in Caloocan where Roldan spent his afternoons. Under the deafening roar of the betting crowd, Mateo walked straight up to Roldan in the bleachers, pinned his hand to the wooden bench with a hunting knife, and took the money directly from his blood-soaked pockets. As Roldan screamed, Mateo looked calmly at the other collectors sitting nearby. The price just went up, Mateo told them, his voice carrying perfectly over the chaos. Next week, I want 10% more. After that, the resistance crumbled. One by one, the remaining dealers and terrified collectors came quietly to Mateo's new, slightly upgraded apartment. They arrived in the dead of night, avoiding eye contact, handing over thick envelopes of cash, and waiting silently for their new instructions. Nobody asked what had happened to Salazar. Mateo didn't offer explanations. Mateo spent most of his waking hours studying the leather-bound ledger book he had stripped from Salazar's body. Inside the dense pages were a chaotic web of names. Regional runners. Mid-level pushers. Payment schedules. Obscure drop-off locations stretching from Pasay to Quezon City. It was everything the dead man had built over 2 decades. To Mateo, staring at the pages under a harsh desk lamp, the system looked horribly sloppy. There were far too many collectors acting as useless middlemen, skimming percentages off the top. He flipped to a page detailing the Binondo route. 4 different handlers touched the product before it even reached the street corners. He picked up a thick red marker. He drew a hard line through 3 of the name's veteran enforcers who bled profit. In the margins, he scribbled the name of a hungry 16-year-old Askel runner who would do the entire route for a fraction of the cost, driven by dog-like loyalty rather than greed. He did the same for Pasay, handing the lucrative southern lines over to Isabella, a ruthlessly smart 17-year-old street captain who already commanded absolute loyalty among the runaway girls working the tourist sectors. Within a frantic, sleepless week, the ledger was bled dry of dead weight. Mateo mapped the new drop-offs on a corkboard, tying red string directly from the main stash spots to the youngest, most desperate street captains. He cut out the fat. He replaced anyone whose loyalty he even momentarily questioned with starving kids from Tondo who viewed Mateo less like a boss and more like a violent savior. The reorganized system ran smoother almost immediately. The profit margins skyrocketed. But as Mateo sat on the small balcony of his apartment counting a fresh stack of bills, he felt a familiar, nagging frustration settling into his chest. It was still just street money. It was enough to live comfortably. Enough to buy his mother a concrete house with a working lock and a refrigerator that stayed cold. But it was not enough to build something truly permanent. It was not an empire. Late one humid, suffocating evening, Mateo sat alone at a plastic table outside a small carinderia near Dagupan Street. He was eating a bowl of hot sinigang, casually watching the chaotic alley traffic exactly the way he had when he was 13. Nothing moved in Tondo without someone, somewhere, noticing. That was why he spotted the stranger almost immediately. The man obviously wasn't from the neighborhood. His tailored linen shirt was too clean, unwrinkled by the oppressive heat. His polished leather shoes were not yet stained by the dark, oily mud of the alleys. But most importantly, he walked without the nervous, darting caution that outsiders usually displayed when they ventured this deep into gang territory. Instead, he moved with the steady, measured pace of someone who already knew exactly where he was going. The man walked purposefully through the crowd and stopped right beside Mateo's table. "You're Mateo Reyes." It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact. Mateo didn't flinch. He didn't reach for the heavy pistol resting against his spine under his shirt. He simply scooped up another spoonful of broth and slowly looked up. Depends on who's asking. The man offered a brief, tight smile, pulled out the empty plastic chair opposite Mateo, and sat down uninvited. Marco Dizon. Mateo chewed his food, his dark eyes never leaving the man's face. When Marco offered nothing else, Mateo eventually sighed and asked the obvious question. "And why exactly are you sitting at my table, Marco?" Marco nodded subtly toward the worn leather ledger resting beside Mateo's plate. Victor Salazar used to keep detailed records just like that, too. Mateo stopped chewing. The air around the table felt 10 degrees colder. He set his spoon down carefully. Marco continued, his voice calm and conversational, unaffected by the sudden tension. "You reorganized his entire supply route faster than anyone on my side expected. It was very impressive work." Mateo's eyes sharpened into tiny slits. "You've been watching me." Marco shrugged casually, leaning an elbow on the sticky plastic table. "Everyone who matters has been watching you. When a kid from the slums shoots an established mid-level supplier and systematically takes over his entire territory without sparking a civil war, people with money tend to pay attention." Mateo reached into his pocket, pulled out a cigarette, and tapped it against his lighter. "And what exactly do you want?" Marco didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked down the narrow, congested street. He watched as two skeletal teenagers on a roaring motorcycle nearly collided with a group of barefoot kids kicking a deflated basketball through the dirt of the street. Then, he looked back at Mateo, his expression turning deeply serious. "You run a very good, very tight system, Mateo." Mateo said nothing. He lit the cigarette. Marco continued, his voice dropping slightly. "But it's undeniably still an amateur street system." Mateo raised a single eyebrow through the smoke. "And?" Marco lifted his hand and pointed directly toward the west, far beyond the dizzying maze of concrete buildings, rusted rooftops, and tangled electrical wires. "The real, generational money in Manila doesn't move through dirty alleys," Marco said softly. He paused, making sure Mateo was hanging on his every word. "It moves through the port." Mateo studied the well-dressed man carefully. The frustration he had been feeling for the past week felt validated. Now that was an interesting proposition. Marco leaned back in the flimsy plastic chair, looking at ease in the slum. The Manila International Container Port processes tens of thousands of steel shipping containers every single week. A ceaseless river of global commerce. His voice remained casual, as if discussing the weather. "But you already know that." Mateo nodded slowly, keeping his cards close to his chest. "I know." Marco smiled, a genuine, shark-like grin. "What you don't have is access." The atmosphere between them shifted violently. That was the very first thing Marco had said that actually mattered to Mateo's future. Mateo flicked his half-smoked cigarette into the overflowing gutter. "And you do?" Marco nodded slowly, his eyes locking onto Mateo's. "I know the right people inside. The people who actually matter. Politicians. Port Authority. Customs. We bypass the container scanning, manipulate the customs risk flags, and run everything through fake manifests." He leaned forward, resting his forearms on the sticky table. "I can bring weight into the city. Cleaner and cheaper than anything Salazar ever touched. But I am a businessman, Mateo. I don't deal with street gangs. I don't collect envelopes from junkies. I need an iron-fisted distributor who controls the slums with authority. Someone who can flood the streets with my product and process the cash quietly without letting the violence spill over into the wealthy subdivisions." Mateo stared at him. It made perfect sense. Dizon had the supply and the political cover, but he lacked the stomach and the muscle to control the thousands of desperate dealers on the ground. He needed a king of the slums. Furthermore, Mateo had already heard vague, unsettling rumors from the dockworkers about armed southern syndicates, particularly the brutal Davao group looking to aggressively push their operations north into Manila. Marco wasn't just looking for a distributor, he was urgently trying to build a local army to fortify his territory before the southern cartels could breach the city. Mateo let out a slow breath. How much weight can you safely move through a single container without triggering an alarm? Mateo asked, his mind already spinning with the logistical possibilities. Marco smiled broadly. Now we're officially talking. He stood up smoothly and pushed the plastic chair back under the table. Meet me tomorrow night. Midnight. Where? Marco pointed again toward the distant, hazy glow of industrial floodlights blooming over Manila Bay. The port. Mateo sat silently, watching the man walk away down the crowded, filthy street. He moved with no hesitation. No fear of the poverty pressing in on all sides of him in Tondo. Just pure, unadulterated confidence. Which ultimately meant one of two things. Either the well-dressed man was stupid. Or he truly did have the systemic connections he claimed to have. Mateo picked up Salazar's ledger and closed it with a definitive snap. Street routes and intimidation had successfully built his foundation. But a foundation was only the beginning of a skyscraper. If Marco Dizon was telling the truth, the next monumental step of Mateo Reyes' underworld empire wouldn't start in the dirt of Tondo. It would start at the docks. The Manila International Container Port was a different universe from the cramped, claustrophobic alleys of Tondo. Mateo stared out the passenger window of Marco's black Toyota Hilux as they drove through the guarded main gates late the following night. Massive, skeletal tower cranes loomed over the deep-water docks like steel giants scraping the cloudy night sky. Blinding, stadium-style floodlights illuminated seemingly endless rows of stacked, multicolored steel shipping containers stretching for miles across the sprawling concrete yard. The air here didn't smell like garbage or frying oil, it smelled heavily of saltwater, ozone, and thick diesel exhaust. The deep rumble of heavy machinery vibrated constantly through the ground. Massive cargo trucks growled as they idled in processing lanes. Heavy-duty forklifts beeped shrilly as they darted between the towering stacks of containers. Massive cargo ships the size of small cities sat anchored in the bay, steadily unloading thousands of tons of global goods. Mateo stepped out of the truck, his observant eyes moving rapidly, cataloging everything. He didn't just see a noisy industrial port. He saw moving systems. He watched the organized flow of the trucks. He noted the precise shift changes of the tired security guards. He analyzed the intricate patterns. He had always possessed a unique gift for understanding exactly how complex machines worked, and this port was simply the largest machine he had ever encountered. Marco closed his doors softly and nodded toward a small, unremarkable concrete office building sitting near the edge of the secondary loading yard. That's where he is. Mateo followed Marco away from the main thoroughfares, slipping quietly through the shadows between two stacks of refrigerated containers until they reached the small, unmarked door. Inside the intensely cold office, a single fluorescent light buzzed loudly overhead, casting a sickly green pallor over the room. Behind a chaotic desk covered in mountains of stamped paperwork sat a man in a wrinkled, official customs uniform. He possessed a thick mustache and tired, heavy-lidded eyes. The man didn't bother to stand when they entered. He didn't offer a polite smile. He simply looked up from his clipboard. Marco spoke first, his tone respectful but firm. Santos. The customs officer closed his folder slowly, moving with deliberate, bureaucratic sluggishness. This him? Marco nodded toward Mateo. Santos rested his elbows on the desk, interlacing his fingers as he studied Mateo for a long, uncomfortable moment. His eyes flicked down to Mateo's simple clothes, then back up to his hardened face. You're significantly younger than I expected for someone trying to play at this table, Santos stated dryly. Mateo shrugged, unfazed by the scrutiny. Is that a problem for your operation? Santos leaned back in his squeaky office chair, a faint smirk playing on his lips. That depends on how serious you actually are. My time and my risks are very expensive. The customs officer opened the bottom drawer of his metal desk, pulled out a thick shipping manifest, and slid it smoothly across the battered wooden surface. A cargo container ship arrives in port in exactly 3 days, Santos said, tapping a thick finger against a specific line item on the document. Mateo stepped forward and looked down at the highlighted text. Origin, Guangzhou, China. Declared contents, commercial plastic kitchen appliances. Mateo looked back up, meeting the older man's gaze securely. And what's actually inside the walls? Santos smiled faintly, a look of pure mercantile greed flashing in his eyes. That absolutely depends on how much empty space you want to pay to fill. Marco crossed his arms, leaning against the office door to ensure it stayed shut. We're starting relatively small for the first run. Proving ground. Mateo nodded in agreement. 80 kilos. Can you clear it through the scanners undetected? Santos picked up his pen and tapped it rhythmically against the desk, calculating his personal risk versus reward. Slipping 80 kilos past the secondary X-ray scanners is difficult. It will cost you a premium fee. How much? Mateo asked flatly. 500,000 pesos. Clean, untraceable cash. Half deposited into a secure account tomorrow, half in a duffel bag when the container doors open. Mateo didn't hesitate or try to haggle the price down like a street vendor. You'll have it. Santos finally smiled fully, revealing a set of stained teeth. He extended a fleshy hand across the desk. Then we officially have a business arrangement, Mr. Reyes. Exactly 3 nights later, rolling under the cover of a torrential tropical thunderstorm, the cargo ship Eastern Jade docked heavily at the pier. Working with practiced, terrifying efficiency, the giant gantry cranes lifted hundreds of heavy steel containers from the deck of the ship one by one, swinging them safely onto the waiting trailers below. Through the pouring rain, Mateo watched from the passenger seat of the Hilux. The specific container number written on Santos' forged manifest appeared right on schedule, lowering onto a flatbed truck. Marco put the Hilux into gear and slowly trailed the heavy flatbed. According to the plan, the driver was supposed to take a sharp turn away from the main inspection gates, pulling the rig deep into a quiet, unlit warehouse sector. But halfway across the rainy tarmac, a set of red and blue flashing lights flared to life. A white Customs Bureau patrol SUV violently cut off the flatbed truck, forcing the driver to slam on his air brakes. The rig hissed to a violent, shuddering halt. Marco slammed on the Hilux's brakes, his face turning pale. That's not Santos' patrol unit. That's a roving perimeter inspector. What does that mean? Mateo asked, his voice dead flat. It means he's not on our payroll, Marco panicked, watching through the rain as a uniformed officer wearing a yellow reflective vest stepped out of the SUV, holding a heavy flashlight. If he forces the driver to crack that customs seal out here in the open, the scanner teams will swarm us. We'll be arrested before we even touch the product. Mateo didn't hesitate. He grabbed the heavy leather bag sitting between the seats, the one containing Santos' secondary payoff of 250,000 pesos. Mateo, what are you doing? Let it go, it's a burned route. Marco hissed. Mateo ignored him. He shoved his door open, stepping out into the torrential rain. The cold water instantly soaked his clothes, but he kept his head low, walking with terrifying purpose toward the front of the stopped flatbed. The inspector was standing by the truck's driver's side window, yelling over the sound of the idling engine. Manifest shows kitchen appliances, but your weight ratio is flagged in the system. I need you to step out and crack the rear seal right now. Officer, Mateo called out loudly, his voice cutting through the heavy rain. The inspector spun around, shining the blinding beam of the flashlight directly into Mateo's face, his other hand dropping toward the radio on his hip. Who are you? You cannot be walking in this sector. Mateo didn't wince against the blazing light. He closed the distance, stopping barely 2 feet from the officer. The wind is horrible tonight, Mateo said calmly. The rain plastered his hair to his forehead. Without breaking eye contact, Mateo unzipped the heavy leather bag just enough. The inspector lowered the flashlight slightly, his eyes catching the thick, compressed stacks of 1,000 peso bills sitting neatly inside the waterproof bag. It was more money than a perimeter inspector made in 5 years. There's a clerical error with the scanning system tonight, Mateo said smoothly, his eyes cold and unmoving. I just spoke with Santos. He said to tell you the kitchen appliances have already been cleared. The inspector swallowed hard. His radio buzzed with static on his hip. He looked at the steel container, then back down at the bag of cash. Fear and greed warred openly on his rain-slicked face. A clerical error, the officer repeated softly, the fight leaving his shoulders. A very expensive one, Mateo agreed. He reached into the bag, pulled out 2 thick stacks of banded bills, and pressed them directly into the chest of the inspector's reflective vest. Have a safe night, officer. The inspector stared at the cash in his hands, paralyzed. Then, without saying a word, he turned, walked rapidly back to his patrol SUV, and killed the flashing lights. He sped away into the stormy night. Mateo stood alone in the rain, unfazed. He tapped the side of the flatbed truck twice. Drive. 2 minutes later, a large warehouse door rolled upward with a metallic screech. The truck backed perfectly into the cavernous darkness. Mateo and Marco stepped out into the dry interior of the warehouse. A small crew of rough-looking dock workers stood waiting inside, holding heavy bolt cutters. They had all been paid heavily in cash. There were absolutely no questions asked. With a loud, metallic crack, one of the workers severed the official customs seal. The heavy steel doors of the container swung violently open. The vast interior space was packed to the ceiling with rows of identical cardboard boxes, all heavily labeled in faded Chinese characters. Marco stepped up into the container, pulled a sharp tactical knife from his pocket, and sliced open the center of one of the middle boxes. He dug through a layer of cheap packing peanuts and pulled out heavily wrapped, cheap plastic blenders. He tossed them carelessly onto the concrete floor. Beneath the first superficial layer of decoys sat something different. Tightly wrapped, rectangular bricks, perfectly sealed in layers of thick brown tape and plastic wrap to defeat the sniffer dogs. Marco pulled one of the heavy bricks out of the box and tossed it down to Mateo. Mateo caught it easily. It was heavy. Dense. Exactly 1 perfectly pressed kilogram. It was pure, uncut product. The highest grade he had ever held in his hands. Mateo stepped up into the container and looked deeper into the dark cavern. He counted the hidden boxes quickly in his head. 80 identical bricks. 80 kilos of unadulterated product bypassing the law. It represented tens of millions of pesos in street value once it was cut, packaged, and distributed through his network. Marco began rapidly tossing the bricks into a large black canvas duffel bag. Once the 20th brick was secured, he zipped the bag shut with a sharp, satisfying sound. He jumped down from the container and clapped a heavy hand on Mateo's shoulder, grinning wildly. Welcome to the international business, boss. Mateo didn't smile back. He just stared at the heavy black duffel bags resting on the concrete floor. 80 kilos. It was more than Salazar had moved in 6 months, and Marco had brought it into the country hidden inside cheap kitchen blenders in a single rainy night. The deafening rumble of the port surrounded them, a chaotic symphony of gantry cranes, hissing air brakes, and idling diesel engines. Thousands of containers just like this one sat stacked in the darkness outside the warehouse, waiting to be sent across the island. Mateo Reyes no longer felt like a desperate street dealer fighting over fractions of a peso in a dirty alley. Standing in the cavernous, shadowy warehouse, smelling the ozone, saltwater, and uncut product, his mind fiercely expanded. He closed his eyes for a fraction of a second, feeling the vibration of the cargo ships deep through the soles of his shoes. The broken, suffering streets of Tondo had forged him into a weapon. They had taught him strictly how to survive the gutter. But looking out at the endless rows of international shipping containers stretching out into the Manila night, Mateo finally understood the true scale of the world. He reached down and gripped the thick nylon handles of the heavy duffel bag. Tondo was just his foundation. The real empire started right now.